John Wilkes Booth. On the night of April 14, 1865, as the American Civil War was drawing to a close, the nation's story took a dark and shocking turn. Inside Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., acclaimed actor John Wilkes Booth stepped out of the shadows and into history. Booth was a charismatic figure, once celebrated for his performances on stage, but beneath the charm lay an extremist zeal. He was a Confederate sympathizer, furious at President Abraham Lincoln's victory and his vision for a reunited America. That night, as Lincoln watched the play Our American Cousin, Booth entered the presidential box and fired a single shot to the back of Lincoln's head, an act that would forever brand him as one of the most infamous assassins in history. Booth fled into the night, sparking a 12-day manhunt that gripped the nation. He was eventually cornered in a barn near Port Royal, Virginia, where he refused to surrender. The barn was set ablaze, and Booth was shot and killed. His body was buried in an unmarked grave at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland, a quiet resting place for a man whose violent act changed the course of American history. Billy the Kid few outlaws have captured the imagination of the Old West, quite like Billy the Kid, a name whispered in both fear and fascination. Born Henry McCarty around 1859, the boy who would become the Kid grew up amid hardship, drifting through New Mexico and Arizona. By his late teens, Billy was already a wanted man, a gunslinger with charm, intelligence, and a deadly aim. He fought in the Lincoln County War, a violent feud between rival factions that turned him into both a folk hero and a fugitive. Legend says he killed 21 men, one for each year of his short life, though historians believe the number was closer to 9. Still, his legend only grew. In July 1881, Sheriff Pat Garrett, once his friend, tracked him to a ranch in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Billy entered a darkened room. Unaware, Garrett was waiting. A single gunshot ended his life at just 21 years old. He was buried the next day in the old Fort Sumner Cemetery, under a simple marker that reads, "Pals." It's said that even now, visitors leave coins and flowers, tributes to a legend who lived fast, died young, and became immortal in Western lore. Manuel Buiso. In the early 20th century, Portugal was a kingdom under strain, its monarchy shaken by corruption, poverty, and discontent. Among those disillusioned was Manuel Buiso, a former army sergeant turned revolutionary. On February 1, 1908, King Carlos III and his family rode through the streets of Lisbon in an open carriage. As the royal procession passed the Terreiro do Paço, gunfire erupted. Buiso and fellow conspirator Alfredo Costa drew pistols and fired repeatedly at the carriage. The king was killed instantly. His son and heir, Prince Luis Felipe, died moments later. The Queen, Maria Amelia, barely survived. The assassins were shot on the spot by royal guards, their deaths instant and brutal. Buiso's grave lies in the Prazeres Cemetery in Lisbon, visited by few but remembered by history as the man who helped bring Portugal's monarchy to its knees. His act, both political and tragic, ignited a chain of events that would eventually end the monarchy and birth the Portuguese Republic. Jan Kubiš and Józef Gabčík. In the midst of World War II, two young Czechoslovak soldiers would risk everything to change the course of history. Their names were Jan Kubiš and Józef Gabčík, men chosen for one of the most daring missions of the entire war. In late 1941, they parachuted into Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia on a top-secret British-backed operation known as Anthropoid. Their target, Reinhard Heydrich, the ruthless SS general known as the Butcher of Prague, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. On the morning of May 27, 1942, as Heydrich's car slowed at a curve in the road, Gabčík stepped out to fire his Sten gun, but the weapon jammed. Without hesitation, Kubiš hurled a grenade that exploded beside the vehicle, mortally wounding Heydrich. The two men fled, sparking one of the most intense manhunts in Nazi history. Weeks later, surrounded by German troops in a Prague church, they refused to surrender. Outnumbered and wounded, they fought to the end, dying heroes of their homeland. Today, Kubiš and Gabčík are buried at the Saints Cyril and Methodius Cathedral in Prague. Their courage stands as a symbol of defiance, proof that even in the darkest times, a few brave souls can strike a blow for freedom. Bonnie Parker and Clyde bear a few names in American history conjure up as much fascination and infamy as Bonnie and Clyde, the young lovers turned outlaws who blazed across Depression-era America in a haze of gunfire, headlines, and stolen dreams. Bonnie Parker was a small-town waitress with a poet's heart. Clyde Barrow, a restless drifter with a talent for trouble. Together, they became legends. Between 1932 and 1934, they robbed banks, gas stations, and small stores across the Midwest, leaving chaos in their wake. To some, they were romantic rebels, modern-day Robin Hoods. To others, they were cold-blooded killers. But their time on the run couldn't last forever. On the morning of May 23, 1934, after months of tracking, police set up an ambush on a lonely Louisiana highway. When Bonnie and Clyde's Ford V8 rolled into view, officers opened fire, unleashing more than 150 bullets. The couple was killed instantly. Bonnie was just 23. Clyde, 25. They were buried separately. Bonnie at Crown Hill Memorial Park in Eden, Dallas, and Clyde at Western Heights Cemetery, only a few miles away. Their graves remain among the most visited in America, symbols of a reckless love story that burned bright, fast, and fatally. Al Capone. In the roaring 1920s, one man's name became synonymous with power, wealth, and violence. That man was Al Capone, the ruthless king of Chicago's underworld. Born in Brooklyn in 1899 to Italian immigrants, Capone rose from street thug to the most feared gangster in America. During Prohibition, he built an empire of illegal liquor, gambling, and corruption that made him a millionaire by his mid-20s. To the public, he was the smiling, cigar-chomping Scarface. But behind that grin lay a brutal enforcer responsible for countless deaths, including the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. Capone finally met his downfall not from murder or mayhem, but from mathematics. Convicted of tax evasion in 1931. He served time at Alcatraz, the island prison built for men like him. After his release, illness and age stripped away his once feared reputation. He died of a stroke on January 25, 1947, in Florida, a lonely end for a man who once ruled a city. Al Capone is buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, alongside his parents and brother. His simple headstone bears only the name Capone, a quiet marker for one of America's loudest legends. Sakamoto Ryoma in the twilight. Years of Japan's samurai era, one man dared to dream of a new nation. His name was Sakamoto Ryoma, a visionary warrior who believed Japan's destiny lay not in isolation, but in modernization. Born into a low-ranking samurai family in 1836, Ryoma grew to despise the rigid feudal system that bound his country in the past. While others fought to preserve the old order, he sought to build a new one, a Japan united under the emperor and open to the world. Through sheer charisma and courage, he brokered peace between two rival clans, Satsuma and Choshu, forging the alliance that would bring down the Tokugawa shogunate. But before he could see his vision realized, fate struck. On December 10, 1867, assassins stormed the Omiya Inn in Kyoto, cutting Ryoma down at just 31 years old. His killers were never officially identified, though many believe members of the Mimawarigumi, loyal to the shogun, carried out the attack. Today, Sakamoto Ryoma is remembered as a national hero, a samurai who traded his sword for ideas and whose death helped usher in the modern age of Japan. His grave in Kyoto is visited by thousands every year, a silent testament to a man who dreamed of a different future. Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, few figures have shaped the 20th century as profoundly, or as brutally, as Lenin and Stalin. Together, they built a revolution and a regime of fear. Vladimir Lenin, the fiery architect of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, seized power in the name of the people, only to unleash the Red Terror, a campaign of executions and repression that silenced dissent through blood. When he died in 1924, his followers turned him into something more than a man, embalming his body and placing it in a grand mausoleum in Moscow's Red Square, transforming him into a symbol of eternal revolution. But the empire he built would be transformed by the man who followed, Joseph Stalin. Under his rule, the Soviet Union became an industrial superpower war built on suffering. Millions perished in purges, famines, and labor camps, victims of a regime that valued obedience above life. When Stalin died in 1953, his body too was placed beside Lenin's in the mausoleum, two giants of tyranny lying side by side. But the world changed. During Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, Stalin's crimes were condemned, and his body was quietly removed from the mausoleum in a midnight operation. He was reburied behind it, beneath a modest bust, stripped of glory, but not of infamy. Today, Lenin's embalmed body still rests in Red Square, a relic of a vanished empire and a chilling monument to the men who ruled through terror. Jesse James in post-Civil War America. One name echoed across the frontier. Jesse James, the outlaw who blurred the line between legend and lawlessness. A former Confederate guerrilla, James refused to surrender to peace. Instead, he carried the war home, robbing trains, banks, and stagecoaches across the Midwest, always one step ahead of the law. To his admirers, he was a folk hero, stealing from the rich and defying corrupt authority. To his victims, he was a cold-blooded killer. By 1882, with his gang shattered and a bounty on his head, Jesse was living quietly under an alias in Missouri until betrayal came from within. On April 3, 1882, as he turned to dust a picture on the wall, one of his own men, Robert Ford, drew his gun and shot him in the back. The death of Jesse James shocked the nation. Thousands came to view his body, and his mother buried him on the family farm beneath a headstone, reading, "Murdered by a traitor and coward whose name is not worthy to appear here." Years later, his remains were moved to Mount Olivet Cemetery, where visitors still leave coins, bullets, and notes, tributes to the legend of America's most famous outlaw, John Dillinger, in the depths of the Great Depression. When America's banks were failing and people were desperate, one man became both a criminal and a symbol. His name was John Dillinger, a bank robber whose charm made headlines and whose gun made history. Born in Indiana in 1903, Dillinger drifted into crime early, but it was his daring escapes that turned him into a legend. He robbed banks with precision, treated hostages kindly, and slipped through police traps with near-superhuman luck. To many struggling Americans, he wasn't a villain. He was a rebel against a broken system, but the law was relentless. In July 1934, federal agents finally cornered him outside Chicago's Biograph Theater. As Dillinger stepped into the warm summer night, a woman in red pointed him out. Gunfire erupted. Moments later, the nation's most wanted man lay dead on the sidewalk, age 31. He was buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, where visitors still leave coins and playing cards, tokens for the man who lived fast, defied the system, and paid the ultimate price. Che Guevara, to some, he was a hero. To others, a ruthless revolutionary. But no one could ignore Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who became a global symbol of rebellion. A passionate idealist, Guevara joined Fidel Castro in the Cuban Revolution, helping overthrow dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Wearing his trademark beret and a fierce gaze, he became the face of revolutionary struggle, a man who fought for equality, no matter the cost. But Che's vision went beyond Cuba. He sought to ignite revolutions across Africa and South America, fighting imperialism with fire and steel. In 1967, while leading a small guerrilla force in Bolivia, he was captured by the army, aided by the CIA. The next day, October 9, 1967, Che Guevara was executed by firing squad. His final words were defiant. "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." His body was buried in a secret grave. Rediscovered nearly 30 years later, today, his remains rest in a mausoleum in Santa Clara, Cuba, where he stands immortal, a face, a symbol, a revolution. Ed Guinan, the quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. The world discovered a darkness it had never imagined. That darkness had a name, Ed Gein. By day, he was a shy, reclusive farmer. By night, he was something far more disturbing. When police entered his farmhouse in 1957, they uncovered horrors beyond belief. Human remains turned into furniture, masks made of skin, and trophies from the graves of the dead. Though Gein admitted to killing 2 women, his crimes inspired some of the most terrifying characters in cinema history, from Psycho's Norman Bates to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Leatherface. declared insane. Ed Gaines spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital, where he died in 1984. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery in an unmarked grave after souvenir hunters repeatedly stole pieces of his headstone. Today, only an empty patch of grass remains, a chilling reminder of the man who turned nightmares into reality. Lee Harvey Oswald. On November the 22nd, 1963, the world changed in a single gunshot. From a sixth-floor window in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald fired the bullet that killed President John F. Kennedy, one of the most shocking moments in modern history. Oswald, a former Marine with communist sympathies, was arrested within hours. He denied everything, claiming, "I'm just a patsy." But before he could face trial, his story ended in a flash of gunfire. 2 days after the assassination, nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot Oswald live on national television, silencing him forever. Oswald was buried quietly in Shannon Rose Hill Cemetery in Fort Worth, Texas. His grave remains a point of eerie fascination, a lonely marker for a man whose act altered the world and left behind questions that will never die. Gavrilo Princip. It took just one young man to start a war that would consume the world. That man was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Princip fired the shots that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Those bullets ignited the chain reaction that became World War I. Princip was captured immediately and sentenced to 20 years in prison, maximum penalty for his age. He died of tuberculosis in 1918, just months before the war ended. His remains were later reinterred in Sarajevo, where his grave bears the inscription, "I am the one who began the Great War." A tragic figure, both patriot and villain, forever tied to the spark that set the 20th century ablaze. Charles Harrelson, before the world knew actor. Woody Harrelson, it knew his father, Charles Harrelson, a real-life hitman whose story reads like fiction. A professional gambler and contract killer, Harrelson was convicted of murdering federal judge John H. Wood, Jr. in 1979, the first sitting U.S. judge assassinated in the 20th century. He later claimed, bizarrely, to have been involved in the JFK assassination, though those claims were never proven. Harrelson spent the rest of his life in prison, dying there in 2007. He's buried in an unmarked grave in Houston, Texas. His life a strange mix of crime, chaos, and conspiracy that shadowed his son's rise to Hollywood fame. Richard Kuklinski, he was known as the Iceman, and for good reason. Richard Kuklinski was one of America's most cold-blooded contract killers, claiming to have murdered over 100 people during his career. Behind his quiet suburban life in New Jersey was a monster who killed for money, freezing bodies to obscure their time of death, earning him his chilling nickname. When he was finally arrested in 1986, police found a man who could speak casually about murder as if it were business. Kuklinski spent the rest of his life in prison, dying in 2006 at the age of 70. Even now, his interviews remain some of the most disturbing ever recorded. The mind of a killer laid bare. Giuseppe Zangara. In 1933, one man nearly changed the course of American history before it even began. His name was Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian immigrant who hated politicians with a burning passion. On February 15th, as President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt gave a speech in Miami, Zangara pulled out a revolver and fired 5 shots. He missed Roosevelt, but fatally wounded Chicago Mayor Anton Kermack. Zangara was captured on the spot, showing no remorse. He was executed just 5 weeks later, in Florida's electric chair. His final words were chillingly simple, "Viva l'Italia." Goodbye to all poor people everywhere. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a forgotten man whose rage nearly altered American destiny.